The cold water, without warning, hit the girl in the head. Water poured over the brim of her cheap baseball cap, soaked the hair beneath, and streamed down her face, neck, and soaked a large swath of her plain gray t-shirt. Droplets of water splashed onto the old, dull, beige tile floor of the Sterling West Precinct Police Department lobby, leaving dark streaks. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee left in the pot too long, damp old papers, and a faint smell of disinfectant that tried to mask the lack of hygiene. The girl stood there for a moment, her whole body stiff with shock and sudden humiliation. She didn't scream, didn't curse. There was only a gasp, caught in her chest, a sound that was a mixture of utter astonishment and barely suppressed anger. Water continued to drip from her hair, dripping heavily down her shoulders, onto the floor, forming a small puddle around her worn sneakers. "I told you to go away!" a man's voice roared, full of anger and contempt, echoing through the otherwise silent lobby. The voice came from behind the tall, sturdy oak counter, where Officer Kevin Rourke, a stocky white man in his mid-40s, with a red face and narrow, glaring eyes, stood. He was still clutching a half-liter plastic mineral water bottle, now empty. He looked at the girl with a cruel glee, as if he had just carried out a justifiable act of punishment. "This is the Sterling Police Department, not some backwater for you to come and cause trouble with. Get out of here before I get really mad." The incident happened so quickly, so shockingly, that several people sitting on blue plastic chairs along the wall were stunned, their eyes wide open, watching the unbelievable scene. A young police officer standing in a further corner, arranging papers, also looked up, his face showing obvious embarrassment and confusion. But he just stood there, showing no sign of intervening. The woman, who had been doused with water slowly, very slowly, raised her head. Water was still running down her cheeks and chin, but her eyes, no longer completely obscured by the brim of her cap, were different. They were cold, razor-sharp, intensely focused, in stark contrast to her now disheveled, soaked appearance. They were fixed on Officer Rourke, piercing his aggressive expression, as if assessing, analyzing, remembering. "My kind," she repeated Rourke's words, her voice surprisingly deep and clear, without a trace of tremor, each word ringing out firmly over the sound of the water still dripping onto the floor. "What exactly do you mean by my kind, officer?" An incredibly violent and prejudiced act taking place in a place that should represent law and protection. Why did this police officer act so cruelly and irrationally? What did this woman in civilian form do to deserve this public humiliation? Will this blatant abuse of power committed in public be covered up, or will she face the consequences? And more importantly, who is this mysterious woman behind the soaked t-shirt and the determined gaze? Join us as we travel back in time, uncover the secrets behind this shocking act, and watch the tense, uncompromising confrontation that is about to erupt at Westbridge Police Station. A week earlier, Isabella "Izzy" Moreau had been sworn in as the new chief of police for the City of Sterling Police Department. At 41, she was a striking African-American woman, not only with the fit, athletic figure of someone who had spent years patrolling the streets, but also with her intelligent, determined gaze and impressive career track record. She had come to Sterling from a larger city on the East Coast, where she had successfully transformed a police department that had been plagued by a crisis of public trust, excessive force lawsuits, and internal conflict. Sterling, a mid-sized city with a rich ethnic mix but also deep economic and social divides, is facing similar problems. Relations between the police and the community, especially with the Black and Latino minority communities, have been severely eroded by a series of controversial incidents in recent years, from complaints of bullying and discrimination to more serious allegations of unnecessary use of force. The city council and mayor, under public pressure, decided to revive the leadership of the SPD and placed high hopes on Chief Moreau, hoping she could bring a breath of fresh air, rebuild trust, and implement needed reforms. Moreau was a hands-on leader. She believed that to truly understand the problems inherent in a police department's culture, she couldn't rely on thick reports, statistical charts, or formal meetings with subordinate commanders in her comfortable office. She needed to go undercover, to see for herself, to listen for herself, to experience for herself how her officers interacted with the public on a daily basis, especially at the lowest levels, where most of the direct contact occurred. She knew that sometimes the true face of an organization is revealed not at the top, but by those on the front lines. So in her first weeks in office, in addition to meeting with community leaders, politicians, and key commanders, Moreau secretly planned a series of unannounced visits to various police stations across the city, especially those with the most problems. And to make these visits truly effective, she decided she had to disguise herself as an ordinary civilian. That morning, she rummaged through her closet, ignoring the neat uniforms and the power suits. She chose a pair of blue jeans that were faded at the knees, a plain gray t-shirt without any logos or images, a pair of old New Balance sneakers, and a baseball cap she'd bought years ago on a trip. She pulled her thick black hair back into a bun and tucked it under the cap, pulling the brim down almost over her eyes. She wore no makeup, trying to look a little tired, like an ordinary working woman dealing with everyday problems. She wanted to see how her officers would handle Maya Jones, as she'd dubbed herself, a plainly dressed black woman who didn't seem important or powerful. First on her list was the Western Regional Police Station, which serves a large area that includes both stable middle-class neighborhoods and more economically disadvantaged neighborhoods that have high rates of street crime and have received the most public complaints about police service over the past 2 years. In a careful review of personnel files and internal complaint reports, though many were closed with insufficient evidence or unfounded conclusions, one name repeatedly came up in connection with allegations of rudeness, impatience, inappropriate language, and sometimes discriminatory remarks, particularly directed at women, immigrants, and people of color. Officer Kevin Rourke, serial number 482. Rourke had been at Westbridge for nearly a decade, spending much of his time on desk duty because an old knee injury had made him unfit for street patrol. Moreau found notes from former supervisors describing Rourke as gruff and difficult, but getting the job done, and complaints were often attributed to misunderstandings or Rourke's outspoken personality. Moreau sensed that Rourke was a prime example of the kind of problem she needed to address at the root, and she decided to visit Officer Rourke first on her tour. To avoid being recognized, she did not drive the shiny black chauffeured official SUV. Instead, she borrowed a late-model Toyota Camry sedan from a close friend. She drove to the area near Fort Westbridge, carefully parking on a street a few blocks away, among the older cars owned by local residents. She checked her outfit one last time in the rearview mirror, took a deep breath, reminded herself of the purpose of the trip, and stepped out of the car, joining the stream of pedestrians on the sidewalk. She had prepared a plausible story, a legitimate reason for a citizen to come to the police station in the middle of the afternoon on a weekday. She would say that she was Maya Jones, lived in a nearby apartment complex, and wanted information about the procedure for obtaining a temporary restraining order, TRO, against an upstairs neighbor who was making a lot of noise late at night and had recently started making threats when she complained. This was a fairly common problem in densely populated areas, serious enough to warrant intervention, but not an urgent criminal case, requiring patience and guidance from the police at the front desk. It would be the perfect test for Officer Rourke's service attitude. When Isabella Moreau, playing Maya Jones, pushed open the heavy glass doors into the main lobby of the Westbridge police station, her first impression was of old and run down. The pale yellow paint was peeling in places, the beige tile floor had a few small cracks, and the community notice posters on the bulletin board looked worn and outdated. The light from the fluorescent lights on the ceiling was dim and yellow, giving the place a somewhat gloomy feel. Only a few residents sat on rows of stiff plastic chairs, looking tired and impatient. The reception desk was made of dark oak, tall and imposing, perhaps the only thing in the lobby that had retained its solidity from the time the station was built. Behind the counter, under a thick bulletproof glass panel with a few small communication holes, Officer Kevin Rourke sat in a worn office chair. His badge and name tag were neatly pinned to his chest. He was staring down at his cell phone, thumb scrolling rapidly, completely oblivious to the person who had just entered. He looked bored, dissatisfied, and a little irritated, as if he were being forced to do a job he hated. Moreau approached the counter, keeping a respectful distance. She waited. A minute passed, then 2. Rourke kept his eyes on the phone, occasionally sniffing or sighing in frustration. Moreau coughed deliberately. No response. Finally, she spoke, trying to keep her voice casual and polite. "Excuse me, officer?" Rourke raised his head reluctantly, his small eyes narrowing at Moreau through the glass. His gaze swept from the cap pulled low over her face to her simple t-shirt, to her worn sneakers. It was an appraising look, and one that did not hide his displeasure. "What?" he asked curtly, his voice hoarse and unfriendly. Moreau tried to ignore the attitude. "My name is Maya Jones," she began, her voice soft. "I would like some information about the procedure for a temporary restraining order. I'm having some trouble with a neighbor in my apartment complex." Rourke let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if she had just asked him to do something extremely troublesome and burdensome. He slammed the phone down on the table with a loud thud. "A restraining order?" he repeated, his voice full of frustration. "You have to go to the county courthouse, not here. We don't issue those. Got that?" He didn't look at her and started fiddling with the papers on the table again. "Yes, I understand that the petition has to be filed in court," Moreau explained patiently, maintaining his respectful tone. "But I have read that a police report is usually required as evidence before filing a petition. I would like to report harassment and intimidation by my neighbor." This time, Rourke cut her off roughly, his voice dripping with sarcasm and contempt. "Harassment? Threats? Just some slumlordy squabble. He plays his music too loud. His dog barks too much. Right?" he sneered. "Look, girl, we're here to deal with real crime. Robberies, break-ins, violence. We don't have time for your petty neighborly gossip. Go home and sort it out." He waved his hand toward the door, a clear dismissal gesture. Moreau's patience was wearing thin. She felt the blood rush to her face, but she took a deep breath, reminding herself of the purpose of the trip. She needed to see how far Rourke would go. "Officer," she said, her voice still calm but now firm and clear. "This is your job. I am a citizen of this city, in need of police assistance, and I have the right to report what I believe to be a violation of the law. I request that a report be made, and I need your name and badge number." The request for his name and number seemed to be the last straw for Rourke. For officers with attitude problems like his, a civilian, especially one he despised, daring to ask for his personal information was a direct challenge to his authority and fragile self-esteem. He rose from his chair, his massive frame almost filling the space behind the counter. He slammed his hand down on the wooden counter with a loud bang, startling the people waiting in the lobby. "What the hell do you want my name for?" "Huh?" he roared, his face red again, veins popping out on his temples. "To go somewhere and file a complaint, right? I know people like you. Always looking for trouble with the police. Now get out of here before I call someone to drag you out for disturbing public order. Do you hear me?" His voice had become very loud, full of menace, attracting the attention of everyone in the hall. Some people began to whisper to each other, their eyes both curious and fearful as they turned towards the counter. But Isabella Moreau was undeterred. She had faced far more dangerous situations in her career. She stood tall, looking directly into Rourke's glaring eyes through the bulletproof glass. "I'm not going anywhere," she declared, her voice firm, showing no trace of fear. "I'm standing here until I exercise my civil right to report the incident or until I speak directly to your shift supervisor." The direct challenge, the unyielding determination of a plain-dressed black woman he had completely despised, had sent Rourke spiraling out of control. All restraint, all professional codes of conduct had evaporated. Racial prejudice, dissatisfaction with his job, anger at feeling his authority challenged, all of it exploded into a single, inexcusable act of madness. He glanced down at his desk, where he was drinking a half-full bottle of Dasani water. In a blind rage, he grabbed the bottle. "You want to fight to the end? Fine, I'll show you," he shouted, his voice cracking with anger. Then, to the horror and astonishment of Moreau and everyone else present, Rourke unlocked the side door of the counter and strode out into the lobby. He marched straight up to Moreau, his face twisted in rage. Without further warning, he uncapped the bottle and tipped it upside down, pouring the rest of the cold water over Moreau's head. Wow! Splashing water. Gasps of shock from onlookers. And then a deadly silence that fell over the lobby of Westbridge Police Station. In the moment after the sudden shock, Isabella Moreau stood motionless in the middle of the waiting room, cold water dripping from her head to her feet, soaking her clothes, forming a small puddle on the floor beneath her feet. The silence in the waiting room became so heavy that one could almost hear one's own heartbeat. The people sitting waiting were all gaping, eyes wide open at the scene that had just happened, unable to believe that a police officer could act like that. The young officer in the corner of the room also stood there, his face pale, clearly shocked but still not daring to do anything. Officer Rourke stood there, directly in front of Moreau, the empty water bottle still clutched in his hand. He was panting, his chest heaving, his face still red from the anger he had just unleashed. There was a twisted look of triumph on his face, but deep in his eyes there was a flicker of confusion, perhaps because of the woman's terrifying silence, or because of the vague awareness that he had just crossed a line of no return. Moreau slowly, very slowly, raised her hand, brushing away the wet strands of hair and the water that was streaming down her face. Then she raised both hands, grasped the brim of her sodden cap, and slowly removed it from her head. Her thick black hair, which had been tied back in a bun, was now loose and dripping wet, completely exposed. More importantly, the removal of the cap revealed her entire face, an intelligent, angular face with keen eyes and a high forehead. The look of a slovenly, anonymous commoner was gone in an instant. In its place was the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to giving orders, someone who wielded power. She looked straight into Rourke's eyes, which were beginning to dilate with a vague sense of unease. "Officer Kevin Rourke, badge number 482, she began, her voice different now. It was deeper, clearer, without any hesitation or softness. It rang with a cold authority, echoing through the silent lobby. "Your actions just now, pouring a water bottle over the head of a citizen seeking help. What was that? First, refusing to take a report, using derogatory, abusive language. And now, physical assault. Is this the standard of community service the Sterling Police Department operates under, officer?" She paused, letting her words sink into the tension. Her eyes never left Rourke's face, watching the change that was taking place there. "Perhaps I should introduce myself more fully," she continued, her voice still cold but with a hint of sharp sarcasm. "I am Isabella Moreau. A week ago, I was sworn in as Chief of Police of the Sterling City Police Department, your new boss. I am making an unannounced visit to your station today in this guise," she gestured to her soaked clothes, "so that I can personally assess the attitude and quality of service of the officers on the front lines. And you, Officer Rourke, have just given me a truly unforgettable performance." If a bomb had just exploded in the lobby, its effect probably wouldn't be comparable to the impact of those words just now. Officer Rourke's face went through a series of dramatic changes in a matter of seconds. First, there was utter bewilderment, then disbelief. He stared at Moreau, then down at her clothes, trying to reconcile the image of the dripping woman before him with the stern, uniformed portraits of the new chief of police he had only seen in internal bulletins and email announcements. Then disbelief turned to pure horror as his brain finally accepted the terrible truth. The red of anger had drained from his face, replaced by a deathly paleness, as if all the blood had drained from his body. "Chief? Sheriff?" he stuttered, his voice shaking, barely audible. His eyes were wide, wide with fear. No, it can't be. You are. Really?" He took a step back, then another, staggering like a drunk. The empty water bottle fell from his hand, rolling across the floor, making small clanking noises in the heavy silence. And then the complete collapse happened. As the full realization of the disaster he had just caused hit him, Rourke's legs felt like they were about to collapse. He threw his hands up in front of him, shaking his head in panic. "Oh my God, no, I'm sorry, Chief Moreau, I'm so sorry, I didn't know it was you, I swear to God, I really didn't know." He began to plead, his voice choked with fear and tears starting to well up in his eyes. I had a really bad day at work. So much pressure, I lost control. I didn't mean to hit you, please believe me." He took a step forward, then almost knelt on the floor right in front of Moreau, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Please forgive me, please. Don't ruin my career, don't fire me. I have a family to support. My wife is sick, 2 children still in school. Please give me a chance. It was just a stupid mistake, a moment of madness. I'll do anything you ask, please." Rourke's desperate, tearful pleas and utter fear echoed throughout the lobby. His demeanor had taken a complete turn, from one of an aggressive, abusive, and contemptuous bully to one of a coward begging for his future. It was a sight both pitiful and despicable. But Isabella Moreau showed no sign of being moved or relented by the tearful entreaty. She looked down at the officer who was almost prostrate at her feet with a cold gaze, not of cruelty, but of deep disappointment and a steely determination. She had seen enough of late tears of repentance in her career. "A stupid mistake, Officer Rourke?" she asked, her voice still cold but full of weight. "You call it a stupid mistake to intentionally dump cold water on a citizen, whoever they are, just because they dare ask you to do your job? You call it a mistake to use derogatory, insulting language based on their appearance and perhaps their race?" She shook her head slightly, a gesture that was emphatic. "No, officer. This is not a one-time mistake. This is a manifestation, a symptom of a much larger problem that exists in the culture of this department. A problem of attitude, of prejudice, of disrespect for the very people we are sworn to serve and protect. That is the problem I was appointed to address. And you just gave me a clear example." She took her eyes off Rourke. She turned to the young officer who was still standing frozen in the corner, his face pale with fear. "Officer!" Moreau called, his voice firm. "Get Sergeant Miller here at once. Tell him the chief is in the lobby and ask him to come here immediately." The young officer jumped, nodded quickly, and almost ran into the back office area. Less than a minute later, Sergeant Miller, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a neat uniform, hurried out into the lobby, his face showing confusion and concern at the urgent news. But when he saw the scene before him, Chief Moreau, whom he had only met once at a command meeting, standing there in civilian clothes soaked from head to toe, and his subordinate, Officer Rourke, kneeling on the floor with a miserable expression on his face, his confusion instantly turned to shock and panic. Sir? Miller stammered, stepping closer. What happened?" Moreau looked straight at Miller, her eyes stern. "Lieutenant Miller," she said clearly. "Officer Rourke, serial number 482 is hereby suspended, effective immediately. Take his weapon, badge, and radio. Take him to a private room and ensure he has no contact with anyone until Internal Affairs arrives. Is that clear?" "Yes. Yes, sir," Miller replied immediately, still in shock. He glanced at Rourke, who was kneeling on the floor, with a mixture of anger and disappointment in his eyes. "And Lieutenant," Moreau added, "I want you to make an official report of this entire incident immediately. Take the statements of all the witnesses present, and I," she emphasized, "will give my testimony as the victim in this incident." "Yes, Chief. Immediately," Miller said, turning to the still-collapsed Rourke. "Rourke, stand up. Follow me." He and the young officer helped the limp Rourke to his feet and led him into the back area, leaving Moreau standing alone in the middle of the waiting room, his clothes still damp, but his expression determined. The Internal Investigations IA unit investigation was conducted with the utmost speed and priority under the direct direction of Sheriff Moreau's office. A senior investigative team was at the West Bridge station within the hour. They did their job in a methodical and professional manner. First, they took a detailed and formal statement from Chief Moreau. She recounted the entire incident objectively, from the moment she entered the station, the initial conversation with Rourke, the refusal of service and the insults, to the water pouring and the revealing of her identity. Her statement was recorded and carefully transcribed. Next, they interrogated Officer Rourke. By this time, Rourke had calmed down a bit, but he was still in a state of panic and shock. Faced with the notoriously tough IA investigators, he no longer tried to be evasive or to blame it all on stress. He admitted to refusing to help Moreau, whom he thought was Maya Jones, admitted to using inappropriate language, and finally admitted to pouring water on her in a fit of rage. However, he still tried to justify it as work stress, not realizing she was the chief of police, and begged for leniency. The IA also took statements from Sergeant Miller, the young officer who had witnessed part of the incident, and the 3 civilians who remained in the lobby after being assured that their statements would be protected. All of the statements matched what Sheriff Moreau had described about Rourke's behavior. Most importantly, the security cameras in the lobby recorded the entire incident in clear, undeniable detail. The video clearly shows Rourke's initial indifference, the increasingly tense conversation at the counter, and his actions as he walked away from the counter, approached Moreau, and poured a bottle of water over her head. The video is ironclad, irrefutable evidence against all of Rourke's defenses. IA investigators also dug into Officer Rourke's personnel file and disciplinary history. They found a series of written complaints from citizens over the past 5 years describing similar behavior: rudeness, disrespect, and discriminatory language, especially toward women and minorities. Most of these complaints, however, ended with Rourke receiving only verbal warnings or counseling from previous supervisors, or even being dismissed due to lack of evidence or no witnesses. The record painted a picture of an officer with persistent attitude problems, tolerated or ignored by the system until they caused serious consequences. With the incontrovertible evidence from security cameras, testimony from the victim, the chief himself, and witnesses, and a history of previous complaints, the conclusion of the IA investigation is clear. Officer Kevin Rourke seriously violated a series of SPD codes of ethics and regulations, including failure to perform duties, disrespect and contempt for citizens, use of inappropriate language, abuse of power, and assault against Chief Moreau while she was acting as a civilian. The matter was brought before the SPD Disciplinary Board. Under close scrutiny, and with a clear message from Chief Moreau that she wanted a tough but constructive response if possible, the board made a decision that is considered unprecedented in the Sterling Police Department. They chose not to fire Rourke outright, which was entirely justified, but instead imposed a disciplinary measure that combined punishment with, eventually, opportunity to correct 1 year, 12-month suspension without pay. This is an extremely severe financial penalty directly affecting Rourke's life and family and is a heavy blow to his career. 2. Mandatory participation in a special intervention program called Second Chance. This is a 2-year probationary program designed specifically for serious cases of attitude and prejudice violations like Rourke's. The program includes a series of strict and closely monitored requirements. Participate in intensive and mandatory training in anger management, non-confrontational communication skills, de-escalation, professional ethics, civil rights law, anti-racism, and identifying implicit bias. Attend mandatory weekly individual psychotherapy sessions with a designated psychologist to address root issues of attitudes, biases, and emotional control. Perform a minimum of 200 hours of supervised community service at non-profit organizations that serve racially and culturally diverse communities in which Rourke may have been biased in the past. Must pass periodic assessment tests every 3 months on knowledge, attitudes, and behavior by an independent monitoring panel consisting of representatives from the IA, the training department, a psychologist, and a representative from the community. Prerequisite. Rourke must successfully complete and demonstrate genuine, lasting changes in attitude and behavior during the 2-year program to be considered for re-employment at SPD. Upon re-entry, if permitted, he will be placed under special supervision for at least 1 additional year. Any violations during the program, or if the supervisory board concludes that he has not demonstrated genuine and substantial improvement, will result in immediate, permanent dismissal, with no opportunity for appeal. The disciplinary decision was announced internally and was also summarized in a press release from Chief Moreau, intended to demonstrate her transparency and commitment to reform. The Officer Rourke incident and Chief Moreau's firm, if unconventional handling of it, sent shockwaves through the Sterling Police Department. It was like a stone thrown into a stagnant pond, sending ripples throughout the ranks. The message couldn't have been clearer. The era of cover-ups, tolerance of misconduct, authoritarianism, and bigotry was officially over under the new chief. Moreau skillfully used the incident, though she never mentioned Rourke by name in subsequent public statements, as a case study in command meetings and mandatory retraining sessions for the entire force, emphasizing her new expectations for professional service, absolute respect for all citizens regardless of circumstance, and the inevitable and severe consequences for any abuse of power or discrimination that was discovered. Naturally, the reaction within the SPD was sharply divided. Good officers, those who genuinely wanted a professional work environment and to rebuild trust with the community, were encouraged and strongly supported Moreau's approach. They saw that at last there was a leader who was willing to take decisive action to remove the bad apples. However, many officers, especially those of the older generation or those with similar ideas and attitudes to Rourke, felt fearful, dissatisfied, and secretly opposed. They thought the new police chief was too strict, not protecting their brothers, and that her methods of disguise were unreliable and dirty. Moreau knew that the road to reform would be long and thorny, but she was undeterred. For her part, Chief Isabella Moreau continued to make other undercover visits to various stations and units, albeit with reduced frequency. She focused more on developing new policies, improving training procedures, increasing dialogue with community leaders, and promoting a culture of accountability from the top down. Her initial actions with Rourke, while controversial, built an initial foundation of credibility and, still very cautious, trust from the public and activists. They saw that she was not just talking about reform, but also taking action. As for Officer Kevin Rourke, he begins the Second Chance program with a mixture of shame, humiliation, anger, fear, and perhaps even a vague resentment toward the person who put him in this position. The 2 years ahead are filled with harsh challenges, requiring him to confront prejudices and bad habits that have been ingrained in his subconscious for years. Whether he can truly change, whether he can make it through the program or be permanently fired, is an open question. But he knows that this is his last chance, and he has no choice but to try to comply or lose everything. The story is more than just an anecdote about a bad officer caught red-handed. It is a powerful reminder of the dangers of implicit bias and abuse of power at any level that can exist and thrive in an environment of lack of oversight and tolerance. It shows how such behavior directly harms the dignity and rights of citizens and erodes confidence in the entire law enforcement system. At the same time, the story is also a testament to the importance of leaders who dare to think, dare to act, dare to face uncomfortable truths, and do not hesitate to apply strict and fair disciplinary measures to create real and meaningful change. Moreau's disguise, while methodologically controversial, clearly became a powerful tool to expose hidden realities and force an entire system to look in the mirror, to look directly at the dark corners and problems that exist within itself. Ultimately, the story also raises a larger question about resilience, about second chances, and the limits of change. Can someone with Rourke's deeply entrenched biases and attitudes truly be reformed through intervention, therapy, and forced education? Or is it a futile attempt? The answer may not be simple, but trying to create a path for change, as difficult as it may be, is better than simply punishing and eliminating without attempting to address the root of the problem. What do you think of Chief Moreau's decision to go undercover to test the behavior of his subordinates? Was it a necessary and effective method, or was it untrustworthy and inappropriate? Do you think Officer Rourke's 1-year suspension and 2-year probation were too harsh, too lenient, or a reasonable and creative solution? We'd love to hear your thoughts, feelings, and diverse perspectives on this dramatic story in the comments below.